Okay, so I will first introduce the traditional way of developing these interventions to change health outcomes, which has been traditionally the main area of application. So we have fields such as health psychology and behavioral medicine who do this. Who are focused on doing this sort of work, but recently, of course, as we will talk about a bit later, different applications to public policy have also started to spring up. But in general, the traditional way of designing interventions is that you have some sort of an like a ground outcome. You have the quality of life, for example, and some middle level outcomes affect that ground outcome. So you have sort of, for example, health and well-being, which are parts of quality of life. So you decompose this quality of life into things like health and well-being. And then you choose one of these or both, and you figure out, okay, so what behaviors pertain to this outcome. You could have, for example, preventive behaviors, sort of like, for example, doing physical activity, which will prevent you from getting non-communicable diseases later on, or remedial behaviors. So, for example, if you have type 2 diabetes, you need to perhaps move more, eat less, and eat in the right way, fast, and so forth. But there are, of course, there are many of these behaviors that pertain to these outcomes, and we would like to map all of those out before deciding what the uh, final intervention should be. But once we have figured out the behavior or behaviors that are going to be our target, we look at the so-called determinants, or many people don't like this term determinant. So people will also use influence on behavior. And we can talk, for example, about social, environmental, emotional, physical, cognitive, dispositional effects on behaviors, which are sort of, because we can't change quality of life, we can't change health and well-being directly. We can't really ethically change behaviors directly, but we might be able to change some of these factors that give rise to behaviors. And there are, of course, many of these that pertain to this one behavior that we have chosen in this caricature, but they might go under, for example, the headings capability, opportunity, and motivation. So all social factors and resource factors go under opportunity. And then we'll find out, okay, so for these determinants, we'll develop the intervention, and for each of these like sub-problem, which is the determinant in question, or the influence on behavior, we figure out how to change this, and we solve that sort of sub-problem. And when sub-problems get solved, then hopefully the ground problem will also be solved. And here's the design very much in one slide, but put quite neatly, I think. And so it describes a process called intervention mapping, which is a systematic approach to figuring out what the problem is, and how to break it into parts, and how to influence those parts. So you have here, you have the quality of life as we had, and you have health. In this example that Kjell Peters goes in through in this video, the target behavior is using a large dose of ecstasy in the nightclub scene of the Netherlands. But so the idea is that we have these environmental conditions which have causes on the health of a person. And these environmental conditions are sort of controlled by some environmental agent. So um, um, so it's not just the behavior of the individual who uses ecstasy. It's also that, for example, we might have an environmental agent who would be in charge of the effective ways to influence the availability of safe uh, drugs instead of black market ones or something like. I don't know anything about this topic. I'm just coming up with examples. Um, so there are these environmental agents that control the environmental conditions, at least in theory. And we have some target behavior we would want to address. So, for example, if the target behavior would be use of respirators in public spaces, you might break it down into sub-behaviors, one of which would be buying or acquiring a respirator. One sub-behavior could be bringing the respirator with you when you leave home. And a third sub-behavior could be putting the respirator on when you're entering the public space. And for each of these sub-behaviors, you then have, again, environmental conditions that affect sort of the, for example, availability or price or um, uh, memory cues at home. So your spouse could be an environmental agent in your home to remind you about the respirator or something like this. And then we have sort of determinants, which are, for example, attitudes, social norms, resources like money. And these are then, again, broken down, decomposed into subdeterminants, which are more granular objects. So whereas this determinant could be social norms, one subdeterminant could be do my friends do this? And so that would be an example of a social norm or a cognition that pertains to a social norm. And then for each of these subdeterminants, you would have sort of applications. So this is the intervention in itself. So it only comes, we've done this much work mapping the problem, and the intervention only now first arrives the scene. And so you get the intervention to this subdeterminant, and you would do interventions for design them for each of these subdeterminants. And underlying these interventions, there are some of these evolutionary behavior change principles, which have some um, uh, parameters for like when is it effective, what things have to be in place for this to work, or for it to work more with a higher probability. So if the problem of a person is the lack of resources, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to motivate them a lot. And if the intervention or the application of a behavior change principle is, for example, vicarious learning. So you see a role model doing something and you're expected to then start thinking, hey, I could do that too. If the role model is someone you really hate, then it doesn't really work. So that would be a parameter of effectiveness. And so this is sort of the decomposition-based planning approach. And one thing that's very important about this is that the application really is only comes into the play very at very late in the game, and this is something that in very many different places it comes up because people really like when you put a bunch of people together and have them discuss about a problem. They really like to start discussing solutions. And oftentimes, what happens is that someone comes up with an attractive solution candidate, and then all the rest of the discussion is about, okay, so how could we do this solution the best? And people might forget that, well, actually, it might make sense for us to first figure out what the problem is. So in both the marketing and in um, academic intervention, behavior change research. One example is that someone really, a stakeholder or someone really often comes up with, hey, we should make an app. And then we start thinking about, hey, what kind of an app? Hey, what would go in it, and what kind of features would it have, and so forth. And we haven't perhaps yet even made sure that our target group uses mobile devices or is interested in downloading apps. And this application, it's usually in the popular science literature, it's there's a lot of different frameworks for what the applications are. So one of these is Robert Cialdini's framework of six these social influence techniques, and these are curiously also a product of reverse translation. So that he studied like car salesmen and people like this, and what techniques they used. And yeah, so if you want to have a look at the evolutionary learning processes behind these and other behavior change techniques, this is perhaps a useful resource. But of course, the problem is that if you want to do something that has extended social value, you don't just want to change a person's opinion or persuade them into doing something. And to that regard, there are a comprehensive, a huge load of different listings of techniques. So the first one pertains to this intervention mapping approach. So for developing interventions, this middle one, it's something that you can use to code existing interventions. It was made because you could have in the literature, you could have this like say that, okay, so the intervention group received counseling, and the control group received a letter or something like this. But what people do when they say counseling could be anything or a huge amount of different things. So this taxonomy tried to make the language such that everyone would use the same term for the same type of intervention, and then they could look at, okay, so researchers could meta-analyze different types of interventions and the technique they used and so forth, trying to find out what works for whom and when and so forth. And the last one of these is a little bit different. I was involved in In doing that, I may have a slide. Yeah, here's the intervention mapping approach. And there's also an article called Core Processes, which describes the main processes that take place in that approach. So in this self-enactable technique listing, what we did was we figured out, okay, so what are the kinds of things that people can do for themselves? So basically, at least in theory, you could have an intervention which could provide resources to people so that people could learn to pick from these techniques and try them out, what works for them, and then start doing this exploration of how to self-manage their own motivation and behavior. But what's important about this is the sort of the grounding that we were thinking about when we were doing this. So we thought of individuals not as something that you control from the outside, from an interventionist perspective, but these individuals actually they seek these basic psychological needs. And they adapt to their environments and other people's actions, and sort of are directed towards growth and their own idiosyncratic goals, both conscious and unconscious, which we might never have any access to. But what this does is that it infuses the system with the inherent non-stationarity. So because people adapt and because people learn and they change their behaviors, there's going to be uncertainty. And what this means is that there's going to be complexity, and we are shifting towards the complex decision-making context.